Late in June of 2018, the rhythm of everyday life began to shift in ways that no one close to Aniya Mack could have predicted. Aniya was 24 years old, a psychology student at Western Michigan University, known for her reliability and warm presence. She balanced her studies with work and was the type of person others counted on. So when she suddenly stopped showing up for her job, the absence did not go unnoticed. It was like a clock skipping beats. People who were used to her steady presence felt the silence in her absence. Friends and family began reaching out right away. Calls rang with no answer. Text messages were sent and stayed unread. For someone like Aniya, who was usually quick to respond, the silence was unsettling. It was as if a familiar light had been switched off without warning. Each day that passed without word deepened the unease. Those closest to her began comparing notes. Friends wondered if maybe she was simply overwhelmed with school. Family members feared something far more serious. The lack of contact was not only unusual, it was entirely unlike her character. Aniya was dependable, responsible, and careful with the people in her life. She was not the type to simply vanish without a word. Police were soon brought into the picture. Officers conducted welfare checks at her home, hoping for any sign that might explain the sudden quiet. The search felt like opening a door only to find more questions waiting on the other side. No signs of struggle were immediately clear, but neither was there evidence of a voluntary absence. The unanswered question remained pressing. The days stretched on, and with them grew the sense that something was deeply wrong. Each hour without answers carried the weight of a storm cloud hovering over loved ones. What began as worry was becoming fear. People clung to hope but could not shake the gnawing thought that something terrible might have happened. As investigators retraced her steps and family prayed for her safe return, a chilling uncertainty lingered. The ordinary pattern of a young woman's life had been interrupted in a way that defied explanation. Where was Aniya? And why had she gone silent? In July of 2018, the quiet town of Comstock Township carried on with its usual summer routines. Families were tending gardens, children played outside, and life flowed as it often does in small communities. Yet beneath that ordinary rhythm, investigators were following leads in the search for 24-year-old psychology student Aniya Mack. She had been missing for days, and the unanswered calls from family and friends hung in the air like static on a broken radio. Everyone hoped she would be found safe. The turning point came when officers focused on an area near a creek in Comstock Township. It was a place where the water ran steady but not loud, the kind of spot one might walk by without paying much attention. On that day, however, it became the center of the investigation. Inside, the water was a large suitcase. At first glance, it looked out of place, as if someone had left behind luggage from a trip that never finished. When it was pulled from the creek, the truth inside revealed itself in the most difficult way. Aniya's body had been placed inside the suitcase and left submerged. The condition in which she was found spoke to the finality of what had happened, yet investigators handled the discovery with care and respect. For the officers at the scene, it was a moment that carried both professional weight and human sorrow. A missing person case had now become something far heavier. As the news spread, it rippled through the community much like the creek itself, steady and unstoppable. For neighbors who had seen Aniya walking to class or greeting friends with a smile, the shock felt personal. It was as if the ground beneath them had shifted, reminding everyone how fragile safety can feel. At Western Michigan University, her classmates and professors received the news with disbelief. In lecture halls and study groups, her absence had already been noticed, and now the confirmation of her death brought grief that words struggled to hold. Family members faced the unbearable reality that the daughter and sister they had been hoping to welcome home was gone. Their worry had turned into mourning, and their grief became a shared grief carried by the wider community. Candles were lit, conversations whispered, and people tried to make sense of what seemed senseless. In every corner of Kalamazoo County, the story of Aniya's disappearance and discovery left its mark. Parents held their children a little closer. Friends checked in on each other more often. The town that once seemed predictable now carried the memory of a tragedy that could not be forgotten. The discovery of Aniya Mack in that quiet creek answered one painful question, but opened another that echoed even louder. The discovery raised one question: who could do this to her? When investigators faced the grim reality of Aniya Mack's death in July of 2018, their work shifted from searching for a missing young woman to uncovering the truth of what had happened. Like detectives assembling the pieces of a puzzle, they began retracing her final steps. Every phone call, every message, every place she had been became part of the timeline. The small details, often overlooked in daily life, now became crucial clues. Their attention soon focused on the people closest to Aniya. In cases like this, investigators know that answers often lie not far from home. Friends described her as open and dependable, someone who always let people know where she was. Yet one name surfaced repeatedly: the man she had been in a relationship with, Donovan Lewis. What was once seen as a private connection between two young people now became the central line of inquiry. As officers questioned Donovan, inconsistencies began to emerge. His explanations of where Aniya had been and what she was doing did not match the evidence investigators were gathering. Like threads pulled from a sweater, his version of events began to unravel. Phone records and witness statements only deepened the doubts. The closer investigators looked, the more the pieces seemed to point back to him. Interrogations stretched on. Detectives pressed gently but firmly, guided not by theatrics but by persistence. Over time, the weight of the facts proved too heavy to deny. Eventually, Donovan admitted to killing Aniya. The words were simple, but the impact was enormous. A confession carries a finality that evidence alone cannot reach. It marked the moment when suspicion hardened into certainty. Yet certainty did not bring clarity of motive. Investigators were left with the difficult question of why. Why would a young man take the life of a woman who had been studying, working, and building her future? Was it jealousy, anger, or something hidden deeper? The answers did not come easily. Much like a shadow that stretches long in the evening light, the reasoning remained elusive. The confession, while closing one door, opened another subplot in the story of this case. Donovan's actions did not stop with the crime itself. In custody, he would later show behavior that revealed another side of his character. It was as if the mask of ordinary life had slipped away completely, exposing a different kind of desperation. The investigation had uncovered the truth of what happened to Aniya Mack, yet it also set the stage for another chapter, one that would show how Donovan Lewis carried himself once the walls of a jail surrounded him. What he did next would shock the community again, leaving many to ask not only why he had committed such a crime, but what he was truly capable of when faced with the consequences. When investigators turned their focus to Donovan Lewis, they were not only looking at a suspect, but at a young man who had once shared a close bond with Aniya Mack. Donovan was in his mid-20s, around the same age as Aniya, and the two had been involved in a relationship that appeared on the surface to be typical of many young couples. They were seen together often, sharing time between classes, work, and the usual routines of early adulthood. Yet beneath that outward image lay a more complicated dynamic, one that would come into focus as detectives examined the details. Friends and acquaintances began to describe tensions in their relationship. What looked like ordinary disagreements to outsiders sometimes carried sharper edges. There were hints of jealousy, of controlling behavior, and of conflicts that lingered longer than they should have. Relationships can often be compared to glass, sturdy and transparent, when healthy but fragile under strain. Cracks may not be visible right away, but when pressure builds, they spread quickly. For Donovan and Aniya, those cracks would eventually widen in ways no one could repair. Investigators pieced together phone records, conversations, and testimony that painted a troubling picture. Patterns of control emerged, small acts that might not have drawn notice individually, but, when combined, suggested a relationship under stress. Donovan's behavior revealed an intensity that seemed less about care and more about possession. It was as if he viewed the relationship not as a partnership of equals, but as something he needed to control. This shift in balance became a thread running through the investigation. When Donovan confessed to killing Aniya, the community was left with the harsh truth that the person she trusted most was the one who ended her life. But the story did not end there. Once in custody, his behavior added another unsettling layer. Only months after the crime, While awaiting trial in 2018, Donovan attempted something that stunned the county. He tried to escape from the Kalamazoo County Jail by jumping a fence. The image of a man scaling prison fencing is striking. It is like watching someone attempt to outrun their own shadow, an impossible task that still reveals the depth of their desperation. For investigators, the escape attempt was more than a breach of security. It was a sign of guilt and an unwillingness to face the weight of his actions. Instead of preparing to account for what he had done in court, Donovan chose to test the limits of confinement, as if freedom could be reclaimed through sheer defiance. News of the escape attempt spread quickly and brought another wave of shock to a community already grappling with grief. It was one thing to mourn the loss of Aniya. It was another to realize that the man responsible had tried to slip away from justice. For many, the act reflected not only desperation, but also a refusal to accept responsibility. It reinforced the sense that Donovan Lewis was not just a suspect who confessed, but someone who would go to great lengths to avoid the consequences of his choices. The failed escape served as a subplot within the larger tragedy. It raised questions about what kind of person would risk everything to leap over fences rather than stand before a judge. It highlighted the unpredictable nature of someone who had already crossed a line most never would. The community could not ignore what this revealed about his state of mind, and so the story pressed forward. With Donovan behind bars but his escape attempt fresh in memory, people began to wonder what might come next. If Lewis could escape jail once, could he also escape justice? When the investigation into the death of Aniya Mack reached its conclusion, the next stage was the courtroom. The trial of Donovan Lewis became the setting where facts would be tested, where evidence would be weighed, and where a community would gather to hear whether justice would be secured. Trials are like long journeys across uneven ground, requiring patience and balance, and for the people who filled those benches, every step carried the weight of grief. Prosecutors entered with a clear strategy. They held in their hands the confession Donovan had given. They had the timeline of events, reconstructed from phone records, witness accounts, and investigative work. They presented the discovery of Aniya's body in Comstock Township, the suitcase submerged in water, and the details surrounding it. Each fact became a brick laid one after another, building a case that prosecutors argued left no doubt about responsibility. The confession was central. Few pieces of evidence speak louder than a person's own admission. Yet the legal system requires more than words alone. Prosecutors supported it with physical evidence and with the timeline of Donovan's actions before and after Aniya's disappearance. Like fitting a key into a lock, each element aligned to show how the crime had unfolded. The defense, however, did not simply remain silent. Their role was to test the state's case, to question whether the confession was reliable, to challenge how evidence had been gathered, and to examine whether gaps existed in the story presented by investigators. Confessions can sometimes be contested in courtrooms, with arguments about the conditions under which they were given. Whether Donovan's defense tried to limit the weight of his words or shift focus to procedure, their efforts became part of the legal back and forth that defines trials. Inside the courtroom, emotions ran deep. Aniya's family filled the seats, their faces carrying both sorrow and determination. For them, this was not only about legal arguments, it was about a daughter, a sister, a student whose future had been taken away. When family members spoke or when their presence was noted, the atmosphere shifted. It was as if the air itself grew heavier. Testimony did not only recount facts, it carried the lived reality of those who had lost someone irreplaceable. Anger, grief, and disbelief all found expression within those walls. The sound of voices giving testimony contrasted with the silence that followed each word, a silence that often spoke louder than speech. Members of the community who attended sat with folded hands, listening closely, aware that the trial represented more than a single case. It was also a test of accountability, a measure of whether justice could be reached when trust had been broken in the most personal way. The trial moved forward step by step, like a clock ticking in steady rhythm. Each new witness, each new piece of evidence, added another layer to the story. For the jurors chosen to sit in judgment, the responsibility was heavy. Their task was not to feel, but to weigh. not to react, but to decide. And so the case of Donovan Lewis unfolded under the bright lights of the courtroom, a stage where truth and accountability were sought with care. As days passed and the arguments grew clearer, one question lingered in every mind. The verdict would finally reveal whether justice would be served. When the trial of Donovan Lewis reached its end, the courtroom settled into a silence that spoke louder than words. After weeks of testimony, arguments, and evidence, the time for judgment had come. Jurors weighed his confession, the timeline of events, and the life that had been taken. Their decision carried the weight of a community's grief. Donovan Lewis was found guilty of killing 24-year-old psychology student Aniya Mack, and he was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. For Aniya's family, the sentence brought a measure of justice, but not relief. In interviews and statements, they spoke of heartbreak, describing the loss of a young woman whose presence could never be replaced. A mother grieves in ways that no court can heal, and a sibling feels the silence where laughter once was. Their calls for justice had been heard, but their longing for Aniya remained. The sentencing was like closing a book without ever reaching the ending one had hoped for. The Western Michigan University community also carried the weight of her absence. Classmates who once studied beside her remembered her energy and ambition. Professors spoke of her potential, her thoughtful contributions, and the career she was building. Vigils were held where candles lit the night sky, like stars pulled down to earth. Tributes filled campus spaces with photos and words of remembrance. Memorials stood as gentle reminders that behind every student's ID card is a dream and a life that matters. The case did more than mark the end of a trial. It opened conversations about issues that affect many communities. Domestic violence and relationship conflict are often hidden in plain sight, like cracks beneath a coat of paint. Friends may notice small red flags, family may sense tension, yet the danger is sometimes underestimated. Aniya's story urged many to look closer, to listen carefully, and to take seriously the warning signs that love can sometimes be twisted by control and jealousy. Community safety also became part of the dialogue. People asked what could be done to support those in troubled relationships and how institutions could provide resources to prevent future tragedies. The memory of Aniya encouraged neighbors to check in on one another, to offer help before silence becomes permanent, and to view safety not as an individual matter, but as a shared responsibility. For those who knew Aniya personally, the memories remained vivid. She was remembered for her kindness, her determination, and her warmth. For those who only came to know her story through the news, she became a symbol of a life interrupted and a reminder of how quickly stability can be lost. Both groups carried her memory forward, shaping how the community chose to respond to violence and loss. The final outcome of the case brought closure to the legal process, but left open the human questions that no court can answer. The grief of a family, the sorrow of a university, and the lessons of a community continue long after a verdict is read. Aniya's story reminds us that behind every statistic is a human life, a daughter, a friend, a dreamer, taken too soon. If you or someone you know is facing signs of control, jealousy, or abuse in a relationship, please do not stay silent. Reach out to trusted friends, family, or local support services. By sharing stories like Aniya's, we keep her memory alive and remind ourselves of the importance of safety and awareness. If you found this video meaningful, please like, share, and subscribe so together we can continue shining a light on stories that must never be forgotten.